Good morning, and
How are you? See you. Good to see you.
many thanks to both, needless to say, for speaking. I know the General was speaking yesterday at the board meeting, which was fascinating, and I talk early and often to Ambassador Edelman, which is always fascinating, so I'm delighted to be modifying, I think was the verb we used. So I thought that was great. Talking about Syria, I love the term Eastern Med because, frankly, it's so hard to determine borders and specific national interests and, rigid. It defies geographic allocation, it seems. But Syria is certainly an ongoing drama. You could go back to first principles, as has been invoked from time to time, and say, why do we care? I think this group and this audience is pretty well versed on why we care, but we might as well just start with that very briefly. And then perhaps go on to, I'd love to hear from you both about what would a policy that actually defends and informs US strategy in the region on Syria look like? What do we want from Syria and what is achievable from Syria? I'm going to lead, Eric.
Well, from the U.S. point of view, I'm happy to speak to why we should care. I think General Amador will, I'm sure, explain to us why Israel cares about what's going on in one of its neighbors right in its backyard, and that's part of why we should care, of course. It's very tempting, particularly in an era of re-emerging great power conflict, which is something that the Trump administration's national security strategy and national defense strategy have emphasized correctly, in my view. That is to say, long-term strategic competition with a rising China and a declining but still very powerful Russia. It's really tempting to say, why do we really care about what the president calls these endless wars, in the Middle East? It's particularly the case, not just because we've had, 16, 17, 18 years of conflict that is in some ways unsatisfying because it doesn't seem to have issued in a definitive result.
And it just keeps getting more players involved.
And it's getting more complicated, but also because one of the underlying premises of our involvement, the need to maintain access to hydrocarbon resources in this part of the world, seems less compelling in a time period where the United States, because of hydraulic fracturing and slant drilling and other technological developments, is now at least energy self-sufficient, if not really energy independent. We're not, strictly speaking, energy independent because energy flows are global, and so therefore we, even if we produce enough energy to support ourselves, some of that's exported, et cetera. But I think it's important to keep a few things in mind. One is that those hydrocarbon resources remain important because were a lot of the resources of that part of the world to go offline, there would be an enormous price effect on the United States because oil is a globally traded commodity, and it would have enormous effect on our economy, on the global economy, so we still have an interest in it for that reason.
Not to mention our allies.
And our allies, who are much more dependent on these sources of hydrocarbons than we are. So although it's very tempting to say this is not a concern for the United States anymore, I think it remains, a concern. Moreover, we know from sad experience, going back to 2001 and before, that what happens in this region of the world doesn't necessarily stay in this region. And the threat that we face and that Israel faces from jihadist activity is not sadly going away. I mean, in some ways, the challenge and the threat is even more complex and more complicated than it has been in the past. We've got more more people in more places that we have to worry about. But clearly, Syria is one of those places. And just in the last few days, the Office of the Inspector General, the Department of Defense, released a report on Operation Inherent Resolve that has found that over the last several months, and including since the Turkish incursion on October 9th, ISIS activity in Syria has increased, and we're looking at the potential prospect for even more activity. That's a potential threat to our allies, since many of the ISIS fighters have come from Europe and have returned to Europe to carry out attacks. I mean, I was speaking to one of my old French colleagues who's actually my former counterpart in the Ministry of Defense, who's now got the same job, political director in the Quai d'Orsay in the Foreign Ministry. This is a major concern for our French colleagues because of the attack
and the Brits.
At the attack at the Bataclan, and the Brits as well. And of course, there's a potential threat to CONUS from this, as well. Moreover, precisely because we're in a period of intensified great power competition, the role that Russia has assumed since September 2015 it needs to be a matter of concern, I think, to us, unless we're content to let Russia be the arbiter of the future of this region. And we just to finish off, Devin, and then I'll shut up. It's notable to me that not just Mohammed bin Salman and MBZ and other leaders in the Gulf region have been traipsing off to Moscow, but I think Prime Minister Netanyahu has probably been to has had more meetings with Putin than he's had here in Washington over the last couple of years. And I don't say that critically.
That could be a good thing.
I don't say that critically. I just say that that's a recognition of a geopolitical reality that ought to give us some concern. Looking back at Russia's historic role, and I think in the Soviet period, and I don't think there's been much change in how they see the region, their objective has consistently been to stir up trouble and keep the region on a low boil.
And access.
And access. And on many occasions, their ability to manage this has actually boiled over and created enormous problems. And then finally, it's also part of the great power competition, but we need to be concerned about what's going on in Syria because of Iran's role, and in particular, the threat that represents to our ally Israel. And I know Israel has taken a lot of very direct action to deal with this in Syria, which I applaud. But I don't think we should just regard this as something that we just leave Israel to its own devices to deal with. I think we have to have an active policy to deal with it as well.
That's why I was going to bring in General Amador. We were speaking so eloquently about the rising Iranian, the ascendant Iranian role in Syria.
Syria is not only the Iranian issue. It's symbolizing the whole situation in the Middle East, in which domestic problems combined with foreign forces and friction between countries out of the region and problems within the region. If you want, you can look at Syria as the symbol of the Arab Spring, domestic problems which became a war between friction within the state. You can look at it as the symbol of the fight between Shiites and Sunnis, and you can look at it from the international arena point of view as a competition between Russia, America, and God knows who else. And all that together is behind the corner. From our point of view, it's our northern border. And I didn't mention Lebanon, which will be much influenced by the results of the what will happen in Syria itself. So Syria is a very complicated pot with so many elements inside that you cannot isolate one of them and to speak about one not regarding the other elements in the pot. And all what I mentioned together is the problem of Syria, and at the end of the day, the problem that Israel is facing dealing with Syria. We took an historic decision in 2011 when we decided not to interfere in the war between the Shiites and the Sunnis. We understood that it is far great issue than people think, and it's not for Israel to be in this historic war between the Shiites and the Sunnis, and whatever will be the results, we will not see there good lovers of Israel. And bad people on both sides. It's not that the Shiites are cruel and the Sunnis are very soft liberal forces. At the end, you have to pick between Assad and kind of combination between Muslim Brotherhood, ISIS, and I don't know what, Al-Qaeda. This is the two forces, the main forces there, and we decided that it is not us to make the decision. They will have, if they want to fight, we will not interfere. We'll give all the humanitarian help to those who will come to the Israeli borders. Either they are from this side or the other side. We help the local people there to overcome the problems of the winter and energy and so on and so forth, but we didn't interfere. After the agreement with Iran in 2015, the Russians sent more forces into the area and built the bases in Syria, and it is connected to the agreement with Iran. Now there is a legitimacy to do it. And we understood that no one outside the region is doing something to stop the Russians. Not anyone in Europe, not anyone in Washington. And we understood that, again, it is something which is, it's like the weather. You have to cope with it, but you cannot change it. For Israel, the fact that the Russians are there is like the weather. We have to understand they are there, and it's too big on us to change the international strategic situation, and what we have is to come to good arrangements with Russia. How can we continue with the Russians inside Syria, very active in Syria, to defend our interests? And yes, Prime Minister Netanyahu met President Putin more than he met any other leader in the world, because no leader in the world has bases 150 miles north of Tel Aviv, and Putin has. So we have to deal with the weather as it is. And we came to, from our point of view, a very good arrangement with the Russians. We have a deconfliction line. We are not coordinated. We are not cooperating. We don't ask them what to do and not what to do. But we prevent any mistake by having this red line.
Can I just ask, do the Americans piggyback on this, or are there separate deconfliction?
Separate deconfliction.
We have our own.
Totally.
Totally separate deconfliction. We have the benefit of having Russian speakers in the Israeli side.
Right.
It's easier. And so we are not coordinating, but we are taking very seriously the fact that the Russians have strong interest in this state. And we try as much as possible not to prevent them from exploiting what they think is good for Russia. It's not our business what they are doing in Syria. If we can continue to defend our interest, and we are doing it day and night. Many times you don't hear about it. Sometimes you hear about it, and sometimes you hear only part of the actions that we are doing. We are very, very active in Syria because we want to prevent one of the consequences of the domestic war in Syria, which is the ability of Iran to build in Syria, within sovereign Syrian state, an independent Iranian war machine, which built on two elements. One are Shiite militias that had been brought by the Iranians, around 10,000 or a little bit more, from all over the world, mainly Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Iraq. By the way, there are more foreigners fighting with the Iranians today than foreigners which fought with the ISIS in the peak of ISIS, in the best days of ISIS. But
Wow.
they are not foreigners. They are militias led by the Iranians, controlled by the Iranians, and we know that they want to use them in Syria. And if it would be if a war between Israel and Hezbollah will happen in the future, they will move at least part of them, if not all of them, to help Hezbollah in Lebanon.
So you said that you're very active in Syria. Do the Russians protest at any point? Do you have to calibrate your actions to
We have to be very cautious. And there
stay
are
below a threshold?
First of all, not even, I don't know, slight problems to any Russian soldiers when we are so active. And for that, you need very accurate intelligence to know exactly not only where your enemies, but where the Russians are. So that we will be very, 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 very careful. And up till now, we succeeded to prevent any even little problem to any soldier from Russia. And the second element is not to push to a situation in which the Russians feel that might endanger the Assad regime in Syria. And this is another delicate situation in which, yes, whenever they fire against our aeroplanes, we are open hell for them. I mean, we don't hesitate. But at the same time, we have in mind that this is the main interest of Russia in Syria, and we should be very careful. And how you be very careful at the same time you defend your forces, it's a complicated...
And how much do they want to protect the Iranians, if at all?
Not at all.
Not at all.
Not all. It's not their interest. They don't speak about it. They don't, I mean, maybe they care about it, but they understand that this is the raison d'etre of our operation. So it cannot...
This is why it's good that Bibi goes and talks to Putin.
It's good when leaders find time and they understand each other better than without speaking. It's better to speak with them. To let them speak. Sometimes. No, they always.
Well,
always.
With all due respect, I don't agree that it's always better, but that's...
Let's the leader to make their efforts and then the professionals level to do their efforts, and a good combination between them, it's a good combination. In most of the cases, I'll be very cautious. In most of the cases, not all the cases. So this is the target of Israel activity in Syria. It's not the Russians, it's not the Assad regime, it's the independent Iranian war machine, the militias, and the Iranian forces led by Al-Quds force, Al-Quds headquarters, Soleimani and his people in Syria. These are the two areas in which Israel is very active, and we are very, very active. And of course, we have to take into consideration the sensitivities of the Americans who are in the east part of Syria. We have to take into consideration the sensitivities of the regime itself. We don't want to open a new frontier with the Turks in areas that the Turks have their own interests, and so on and so forth. So it's a very delicate dancing, which on the other side, it's clear who is the enemy, the Iranians, but there are so many elements in the area that should be taken into consideration when we are acting there, that it is very complicated decision-making process again and again and again. And remember, we don't know when the reaction of the other side will be such that we will have to be in much more, how to call it, bigger operation.
Well, it's always been of interest to me, the Israeli attitude about Bashar. And when Bashar was less potent, if you will, there was a moment where he was profoundly unpopular, and it looked like he was certainly not his father. We have a newly empowered Bashar at this point. He's retaking territory. I'd be curious of what you both think his ambitions are, whether that means he understands that his power is only as good as his proxies, if you will, or his supporters. What kind of concoction that brew will be for U.S. and Israeli interests.
Well, I think his ambition is to, in as much as he can, with the help of his Russian and Iranian patrons, because he can't do it on his own.
But these are two separate patrons, basically. They're not co-conspiring, or they are?
They share an interest with him, the three, to maintain the regime in power. Where I think the kind of rubber meets the road, where the difficulty comes in how far they will go to reestablish his power, throughout the country. If we were to completely vacate, even our very small presence, which has been very limited, and both in cost and it's been limited in size and footprint. It's been limited in mission. Cost, and it's been limited in casualties, and it's been limited in mission. I mean, the formal mission has always been to fight ISIL, but I don't think it has escaped anyone that the presence there has also served other useful purposes from the point of view of the United States, and I would say other actors in the region. That, since October 9th, has come a little bit unglued, and it has. Before October 9th, the YPG, who were our allies in the fight against ISIL, controlled a fairly large slice of Syrian territory, and also the bulk of the energy resources, and the geographic area that we were occupying, and particularly the small presence we have in the south at Tanf, was useful for keeping an eye on the Iranians, and particularly their effort to establish a land bridge across into Syria, all the way to Lebanon.
Which we've agreed they have established at this point.
I defer to General Amador about whether they've actually established it yet. I think our ability to keep an eye on it and to therefore interdict it if we ever chose to, which was something the Iranians were watching, has been not ended but diminished by the decisions to withdraw some of our forces and the uncertainty that's been created about precisely what we're doing, what the duration of our presence, and what our folks will be doing.
What would you say, General?
The presence of the American forces in Tanef is very important because this is the main gate leading from Iraq into Syria. It is true that the Iranians have something in the north through which they are leading the land corridor into Syria, and after the last decision of the Americans, they were sure that that will be even more open for their purposes. It is not clear yet what exactly will be the structure on the ground, but no question that Tanef is very important to block the main road of the corridor, and not less important, it is the sensitivities of the Jordanians, not to see the Iranians on their borders directly from the north, and I think it's very important for the stability inside Jordan to keep those forces. I would say it's even more important than for us.
How well, just sidebar, how well understood do you think this is within the broader national security community here in Washington?
In the U.S.?
Well, not in the U.S., in Washington. I mean, in terms of the policymaking community, is it a shared principle that this one critical node is?
I think it's shared by Secretary Esper, Secretary Pompeo, certainly by my colleague Jim Jeffrey, who is the special envoy for dealing with ISIL. I don't think, and it was certainly the case with John Bolton when he was National Security Advisor. I can't speak for Robert O'Brien.
Right,
I don't know.
That was
what
just
Robert,
a sidebar. I'm just.
I don't know
curious
what
about that.
Robert thinks about it, but
Right.
I think in the case of almost everybody else, there's no doubt about it.
Yeah. But I'm sorry, I interrupted you, General. You were.
So this is from our point of view. We understood that Americans came to fight ISIS, but by existence, as we used to say about the British Navy, by existence, they are preventing part of the abilities of the Iranians to use the land corridor, and slowly, Iraq is becoming logistically more important for the Iranians because they understand that inside Syria, our intelligence superiority and ability to attack their facilities is much better than in Iraq. And slowly, Iraq is becoming logistically more important for the whole idea of the Iranians to build the ring of fire against Israel. We understand the sensitivities of the Americans in Iraq, and it's so intelligence-wise, it's not as easy to collect there as it is in Syria because of the range. But this is why, if you look at it from the Iranian point of view, the fact that the Americans are still concentrating around Tanef and the oil fields and so on and so forth, it's part of the barrier that they see building the open corridor that they had in mind when they spoke about it. But still, it's open in the north. It's not the same level of openness that they want to have the minute that the Americans will pull out from Tanef. This is the importance of this area. It's the south part of the American existence.
Devin, if you'll permit me, I think there's an incredible strategic irony, I think, here, which is at the very moment that the Iranian regime is now going through an enormous crisis, both domestically and in terms of its
financials,
of its overseas policy, right? There's a major rebellion going on in Lebanon against the Iranian proxy forces in Lebanon against Hezbollah. There's a major rebellion going on in Iraq against Iranian overweening influence in the country. There's a crisis at home that is so great that they have decoupled the entire country from the internet. I saw videos last night of tanks in Shiraz. There are reports that the southern part of Shiraz is completely out of the control of the regime. You're seeing spontaneously slogans appearing painted on graffiti on city walls in Tehran saying, "The hell with the Palestinians, our enemies are here at home." You're seeing people calling for the return of Reza Pahlavi to the country. I mean,
and a huge economic crisis.
It's all been precipitated by a huge economic crisis. It's been precipitated by the effect of U.S. sanctions, which I'm not all that inclined to give a lot of credit to this administration, but in this instance, they deserve it. I mean, everyone said that if we got out of the JCPOA and tried to impose sanctions on our own, it would fail because we needed the rest of the world. Maybe not so much.
Clearly not so much.
But what sense it makes, given that, to be giving them a free pass in Syria, which is pretty important for them, while all this other stuff is going on, to me, just makes no strategic sense at all.
Ironically, it's the only area in which the regime can show a success.
Right.
No.
The regime in Tehran.
Right.
And I think that from our point of view, the more pressure they will have regarding to those issues, it will be more complicated and for them to continue with their plans. And I'm telling you, from the last few weeks, they continue and we continue aggressively to try to strike on them. But
just the other night.
But the other night was open to the media. I'm speaking about
Yeah,
operations
right.
without under the radar of the media.
Right.
And the fact that they can show a success in this part of Syria is helping them. Although at the end of the day, I don't know what will be the results, because it's here. No one is yet made the final decision.
Well, I want to go to questions. That brings the last point I wanted to raise. Once again, America has not had a strategy towards Iran and the region. In 2009, when there was the same kind of domestic upheaval, not financially driven, we just were absolutely silent. We've had opportunities to at least diplomatically acknowledge the kind of resistance that's going on. Now you've described a situation where, other countries are stepping up and doing this. So if we had a policy, we're going into an election year and it's all going to be under the chaos of the elections, and foreign policy typically doesn't surface that much, but were we to come up with a strategic vision of what might be doable, just briefly, give us points on that, and then we'll take some questions.
Well, I think we've squandered an enormous amount of what we had achieved in Syria over a four-year period under two administrations. By first the announcement in December of 2018 that we were going to get out, and then getting out of the way for Erdogan to launch his intervention, which has destabilized a part of Syria that had been actually, ironically, one of the few actual stable parts of Syria for the last number of years. So in the first instance, I think we need to make it clear we're staying, we're going to be there for the duration for the reasons that General Amador just said in terms of what the Iranians have to calculate, what the regime has to calculate, and that we anticipate that we will play some role, and our presence is not going to end until we play some role in whatever ultimate political disposition occurs in Syria, although I wouldn't be holding my breath for that. But I think the real thing is that, to pick up on what General Amador is saying, is Iran. We ought to be putting as much pressure on Iran as possible. I mean, the agreement that he mentioned that was facilitated by the JCPOA in the summer of 2015, but we know that immediately after the document was agreed, and it wasn't, I don't say signed, because I like to point out to people that the thing was never signed by anybody, but it
Announced.
It was announced.
It was announced.
As soon as it was announced, Qasem Soleimani was on a plane to Moscow, where a functional division of labor was agreed between the Russians and the Iranians, because the Syrian regime was reaching a manpower crisis and was unable to actually execute the civil war anymore. And the clear division of labor was that Russia would provide essentially air power and long-range strike from the Eastern Med or from the Caspian, wherever. And the shock troops would be, as General Amador said, supplied by Shia militias from Afghanistan, from Iraq, from some from Hezbollah, from Lebanon, some from Iran. It's sort of like it's like the equivalent of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade in the Spanish Civil War. It's the Khomeini Brigade. So that's what turned the tide here in 2015. So we ought to be pushing back against that, and we ought to be pushing back against it in Iran. We have a golden opportunity now, given what's going on in Iran, to up the pressure. We ought to be, first of all, engaged in massive cyber operations to reconnect the internet in Iran. We ought to be using satellite, those who have satellite internet access, which is the only access right now that people have, to flood Iran with information about the corruption of the Ayatollahs and the clerics regime.
The Iranian expat community is all about that.
No, we ought.
You can do it.
It's cheap. It doesn't cost us very much, and we ought to be doing it. And we ought to be, I mean, Secretary Pompeo, to his credit, has said we stand with the Iranian people. We ought to be saying that more and more loudly. My fear is that there are folks in the administration who think this is just the right time for us to negotiate a better JCPOA deal. And my view is this is the worst possible time for us to be reaching out and giving the regime a landline. You know, they are on the potential cusp of disintegrating. I mean, that's not to say they won't survive, but they're in a Tiananmen moment right now. They're either going to have to use massive repression, you know, and count on, and I think one of the key variables is going to be whether the IRGC and Basij that are in various places are locally recruited or whether they're from other parts of the country. Because if they're locally recruited, they're going to have a lot of trouble. And there's already evidence that they're having trouble getting people in the Artesh to actually fire on demonstrators.
I've been asked to turn the mic over to questions, which is a brilliant idea. Would you be willing to just start with your response, and then we'll just hand a mic to the first question? Yeah, generally, you can just.
Does anybody have a question? We'll bring the microphone over to you. Just raise your hand. Does anybody have a question?
We were so clear that.
Hi, Matt Berger. Just a quick question. You know, the drone strike on the Saudis, and you know, there's been almost an escalation on the part of the Iranians recently. Do you see that as playing to their base, lashing out in a sort of dying beast kind of way, or what do you think the logic behind that is?
I think a part of the logic is to, you know, intimidate their most important regional rival, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, in the Gulf. Not the most important regional rival more broadly, but in the Gulf to intimidate the Saudis, to make the Emiratis worry about the vulnerability of their infrastructure, both tourist and trade infrastructure. I mean, obviously, Emiratis have done a lot to build up Dubai and Abu Dhabi. This is all meant to, you know, as an instrument of intimidation and drive a wedge between them and the United States. You think the United States is going to protect you? Well, we're going to show that we can strike you with impunity. We can strike in the Gulf, and we can strike Abqaiq, and you know, go see if the Americans are going to help you. And I think I mean, Mike has written about this several times, the fact that we've had, you know, a bunch of attacks that have been clearly sponsored by Tehran and no response has emboldened them to do more. I mean, that just stands to reason.
If I may, the last operation against the oil in Saudi Arabia was done directly from Iran by Iranians. It's known to everybody in the operational circles. It's not any proxy attack or something, etc. It's directly from Iran by Iranians. And I think that it is to intimidate the Saudis, but to hint to them that America cannot defend them. And I think that the Iranians wanted also to show that if their oil will not come out from their sources, they can stop the oil around the world, and it's not just the Iranian oil, it will be even more problematic for the world. So there are some countries that, unlike America, are not independent in their energy sources. They need badly the oil from the Middle East. And I think that here there is something which is going maybe to a more sophisticated way of thinking of the Iranians. It's if they succeed to intimidate the Saudis and to make clear to the Saudis and their allies, the other Gulf countries, that America cannot defend them or doesn't want to defend them, and the result is the same. Maybe they will find ways to compromise with Tehran. And as illogic as it looks today to say it, you have to take it in consideration. If those countries will feel in the future that they had been exposed to the Iranians with no any American shield to defend them, they might turn to the Iranians and to find a way to compromise with. This is not a question for me. I don't give advices to the Americans what to do.
Well, there have been press reports that there have been some responses to some of this Iranian activity, but it's come allegedly, according to press reports, in the form of various cyber attacks. I mean, I suppose that's better than nothing, but it doesn't deal with the problem that General Amador just very, I think, lucidly exposed, which is the danger that this campaign of intimidation will ultimately, undermine U.S. alliance structure in the region.
We've got a question right here.
Yeah.
Who in the administration do you think has the best grasp on how to deal with Iran?
Former security advisor?
Yeah, but Maury's question was who currently
No,
in the administration.
I know, that's my point.
I think Secretary Pompeo, based on some of what he said publicly, but I'm not sure that he has complete freedom of action to actually, if he were operating on the principles he announced at Simi Valley, I would feel more comfortable, but I don't see any evidence of that right now.
Yeah.
Just what is the interest of the Russians in Syria other than prestige, and what can the U.S. do about it?
Their port.
They've got, they've got the port at Tartus, which allows them to reinsert themselves in the Eastern Mediterranean, which is something we've addressed in the task force report that of the Eastern Med Task Force that General Wald and I co-chair. They've been absent from the Eastern Med for any number of years, but they're now back. And not only do they have the base, but they've used the Eastern Med to as the platform for missile attacks into Syria, which both serves and I don't think it served a particular military purpose actually, but it served a broader purpose of regional policy to announce their return, to make sure people realize that they have these kinds of capabilities which could be turned on others. And frankly, as advertising for Rosoboronexport, the Russian Defense Export Agency, which, among other things, is responsible for the sale of the S-400 missiles to Turkey, which I'm sure we'll talk about in the next panel.
Yeah.
I think it's all these elements are there, but I think there is something deeper in from the Russians' point of view. And here I'm quoting Russians officials and semi-officials. First of all, they're afraid that they will lose credibility by not standing with a regime with which they had long cooperation in the past. And they looked at the attitude of the Americans towards Mubarak and they said, we have to show that we are not like the Americans, first. Second, they're afraid that they will lose all their investments and they're afraid from a Libyan result. And they said, we believe that what the West promised us to do in Libya, that what would be done. And at the end, we found ourselves without Libya at all. It's complete chaos. We lost all our investment in Libya. We don't have anyone to speak with, and so on and so forth. We don't want this situation in Syria. And here is coming the geographic issue, which is it's very close to Russia. And if here in Damascus we will see kind of very extreme Sunni regime, it was before ISIS. They didn't have ISIS in their mind. They had Muslim Brotherhood or Al-Qaeda or combination between them. That might go back into the Muslim community in Russia and might be a very problematic situation for us. So we have to do whatever is needed to help the regime with which we have relations to prevent chaos in this area and to guarantee that at the end it will not be controlled by Sunni extremist movement that might see Russia as the next target. So it's a combination of very realistic approach to the situation, with some needs to see the new Russia is not as you think, very little, very important. What President Obama said, it's a regional superpower. No, we are a real superpower. Look what we have. We can bomb from the Caspian Sea targets in Syria. And you ask yourself professionally why they need it. They had an airbase 100 miles from the target, so why to launch it from the Caspian Sea? No, we have to show everyone that we have this capability. So it was a combination of...
And we're willing to sell it to you.
And at the end, if you want to buy, here's the
demonstrator
capabilities,
effect.
this is the price, and it's open.
Right.
But I think that for them, even if it will not be bought by anyone, just to show that they have it, and Russia, it's not the Russia that you can read about in the American newspaper. We are stronger than you think, and we have still superpowers capabilities, and we have to show it. For them, it was very important. It's not just the economic question of selling, it's also to show we are still a superpower, and you have to change your attitudes towards us because we are a superpower. Because remember, Russia was ignored by so many around the world, and they have to show that they can take part in such situations.
This is a point that is so important. But in the Middle East and elsewhere, signaling is something Americans never understood terribly well.
Just to add to what General Amador just said, first, on the question of Russian reliability and credibility in the wake of U.S. decisions that called into question U.S. reliability, the Russians are very explicit about this in October. When they came in and began to take over American positions after the Turks entered northeastern Syria on October 9th, Foreign Minister Lavrov and Russian propaganda outlets like RT and Sputnik were explicitly saying this. You know, we're here, we're taking over from the Americans because we actually back up our friends and allies, unlike the Americans. And I would just add one more element to the point that General Amador made about standing by the regime and standing by a country to whom they've invested a lot. From President, this is not just a Russian government policy, I think. This is very much a personal issue for President Putin, because he sees what began happening in Syria, what happened in Libya, as basically US-sponsored color revolutions, like the revolution in Ukraine in 2004, the ones in Georgia and elsewhere. And he believes that ultimately those are aimed at him, and that our objective is to destabilize Russia and overthrow Russia's regime with the color revolution. And for that reason, he sees what was happening in Syria as a very direct personal threat to him.
We have another question.
Yeah.
Hi, Daniel Pipes. General Amador, your government is very active in taking out potential threats, be it Osirak far away long ago, or these days in Syria. How is it, given that context, that there's something like 150,000 rockets and missiles in southern Lebanon that Israel has somehow allowed to be built up?
And the way they're built up.
Look, it's, I think that one of the most complicated decisions to take in a democratic country is preemptive strike. Because you lead your people to a war that might be not needed, because you don't know what will happen in the future. In retrospective, I can say that the decision not to bomb any new convoy which brought missiles into Lebanon from Syria was a mistake. But that can be done in retrospective. It's very easy in a very nice place in Washington. To sit somewhere in Jerusalem in 2006 to make such decision probably was not so easy. Remember, we came out from the operation in Lebanon not with
Glowing.
with the best feeling about our functioning systems and so on and so forth. So the decision to go to a preemptive war after 2006 was in the atmosphere of the State of Israel and the Middle East was almost impossible. But we learned the lesson. And one of the reasons that we are so determined to prevent the Iranians from building the independent war machine is the lesson from Lebanon. And it's very much connected. We understood now that if that will not be prevented in advance, we might find ourselves that on top of what they have in Lebanon, they will have an independent war machine in Syria. And this is something devastating from the ability of Israel to defend itself. And by the way, just a remark about what was said by the honorable member of the House. We don't want American soldiers to sacrifice their life for defending Israel. We want money, we want technology, we want umbrella in the international community, we want intelligence, whatever. We don't want American soldiers to be sacrificed to defend Israel. Israel will defend itself by itself, with a lot of help from America, but does not include American soldiers. And that should be very, 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 very clear. But we understood and we learned the lesson of Lebanon, and you see the result now in Syria. And remember, it's not easy. We don't know what will be the reaction of the Iranians tomorrow or next week. The Iranians have huge capabilities in the area, in Lebanon, and something in Syria. But we are determined not to let the same mistake that we did after 2006 in Lebanon to occur in Syria.
Can I just
but I'm saying mistake in retrospective. I'm not sure that if I would be in the closed room in 2006 that I would take another decision.
But were the missiles not always being inserted almost immediately into orphanages and kindergartens? And I mean, weren't
Where, in Lebanon?
In Lebanon. Weren't they always housed
yes,
in
but we have enough capabilities to identify many of them, not all of them, and professionally it could be done. But the decision was not to do it because we understood the consequences. By the way, if you look now and you ask yourself, okay, if this is the situation, why Israel is not striking first in Lebanon? Because everyone understands that will be devastating war. Out of 100,000 rockets and missiles, even if we will be genius and Iron Dome will work fantastically and so on and so forth, you have to take into consideration that I don't know how many thousands rockets and missiles will land in Israel and will kill Israelis and destroy houses in Israel. And what does it mean to Lebanon? Lebanon will be destroyed, not because we want, but because all these 100,000 rockets and missiles based, not all of them, but I don't know, 60, 70% based, stored by the Iranians and Hezbollah in private houses. What will happen to the local areas? Part of those places will evaporate because think about an area, I don't know, a square mile with 10 missiles in some basement, add to that the fuel of the missiles, add to that the TNT which will be launched by us to bomb them, and the area will evaporate. How many Lebanese, innocent Lebanese, they don't know about the missiles at all. So to make now a decision about preemptive attack on Lebanon, it's a huge issue, and don't see if we will not have a good excuse how government Israel will make such a decision. At the end of the day, we are not Russia, and we are not the United States of America. We need legitimacy inside, as you, but we need legitimacy outside that you can ignore. We cannot. So it's a very problematic situation, I agree. The result of not acting since 2006 is very bad, but it doesn't mean that we can do it today, although we understand that it is a bad situation, very bad situation. What we can do is to use the aggressiveness of the Iranians to change the status quo and to say, we will not let the status quo to be changed in Syria, and everyone understand, from Moscow to Washington. That can be understood. Even the Europeans are not saying anything against it. Why? They understood. It's not a situation with Lebanon, because in Lebanon, it will destroy Lebanon. Lebanon will not be Lebanon after the war. Not because we want, because think about 100,000 rockets and missiles spread all over Lebanese populated areas.
With that sort of dismaying thought, thank you both so much. This was absolutely fascinating. The cautionary tale of how America's withdrawal might